This wasn't a bad night. It was a warning. Late Monday night on a dark Miami tarmac after the college football national championship, Donald Trump stepped in front of cameras and said things that don't normally get said out loud. Not in passing, not as jokes, and not without consequences. The paradox is this: he called it peace while describing actions that would pull the United States closer to open conflict. And whether you follow politics closely or not, this matters to you, because these aren't abstract debates. These are the alliances that protect trade, prices, travel, and security in your daily life. Standing there, Trump confirmed something directly. When asked, "Have you invited President Putin to be a member of the Board of Peace?" he answered, "Yeah, he's been invited." No clarification, no hesitation. That single sentence landed on camera, on record, and it instantly collided with decades of U.S. foreign policy. A peace board that includes Vladimir Putin while NATO allies are being publicly threatened is not a misstep. It's a signal. But here's where the story flips. Within moments, that same appearance turned personal and punitive. After French President Emmanuel Macron declined to participate, Trump threatened France with a 200% tariff on its wines and champagne. He didn't stop there. He added that Macron would be out of office very soon. That wasn't diplomacy. That was leverage spoken out loud, aimed at a U.S. ally on a runway in real time. Now notice what wasn't denied, walked back, or softened, because as the cameras kept rolling, the scope widened even further. Greenland, NATO, the Nobel Peace Prize, claims of ownership, claims of control, claims of historic entitlement. Each statement stacked on the last, faster than anyone tried to slow it down. And by the end of it, this no longer sounded like a chaotic press conference. It sounded like a preview. The question isn't whether this was normal. The question is, what happens if it keeps going? What happened on that tarmac wasn't isolated. It fit a pattern that's been forming in plain sight. The core event wasn't the insults or even the threats. It was the way power was being framed as something personal, transactional, and immediate. Allies were no longer partners. They were leverage. Participation was no longer voluntary. It was something that could be bought, coerced, or punished. Look at the sequence. First, the confirmation. Vladimir Putin invited to a board of peace. That's a fact, on camera. Then the response to refusal. When Emmanuel Macron declined, Trump didn't describe a disagreement between governments. He went straight to tariffs. 200% on wines and champagnes. He even added commentary about Macron's political future. This wasn't policy language. It was pressure language. Now ask yourself a different question. Why say this here? Why say it this way? This wasn't a closed-door meeting or a diplomatic cable. This was a brief, late-night press conference outdoors after a sporting event with cameras rolling. That choice matters because it turns private leverage into public theater. It normalizes the idea that international relationships are negotiated like on-the-spot deals, enforced by threats, and performed for an audience. And here's the detail that reframes everything. When asked again whether Putin had been invited, Trump didn't pivot. He doubled down. Yes, he's one of the people. That's not ambiguity, that's positioning. At the same time, NATO allies were being mocked, pressured, or dismissed. He claimed he had done more for NATO than anybody else, while also suggesting the alliance wouldn't exist without him. This is where the pattern becomes clearer. Peace is being defined as obedience. Cooperation is being replaced by compliance. And refusal is met with punishment. That's not speculation. That's the structure you can hear in the words themselves. So the real issue isn't what he said about France or Greenland or Norway. The real issue is what this framing enables next. There's a claim buried inside that moment that changes how everything else should be interpreted. The claim is that this wasn't impulsive. It was intentional. And the proof comes from what Trump chose to confirm, not from what his critics said afterward. On camera, when pressed again, he said it plainly. Yes, he's one of the people. He was talking about Vladimir Putin, not hypothetically, not as a rumor, as a confirmed invitee to what Trump called a board of peace. That's a concrete detail, and it matters because, in the same breath, he described that board as being made up of world leaders while actively attacking leaders of NATO countries who didn't fall in line. Notice what's missing here. There was no explanation of how this board works, no mention of Congress, no reference to treaties, legal authority, or existing international structures. The United Nations wasn't acknowledged. NATO wasn't consulted. The entire framework was personal. He decides who's in, he decides who's out. And if you're out, there's a cost. That cost was spelled out clearly. I'll put a 200% tariff on his wines and champagnes. Those were his words, referring to France. Tariffs aren't symbolic. They hit prices, supply chains, and trade relationships. And he paired that threat with another detail that slipped by quickly but landed hard. He said Macron would be out of office very soon. That's not economic policy. That's political pressure, stated openly. This is where the story tightens, because these weren't abstract claims about strength or leadership. These were specific actions attached to specific countries delivered in real time. And while the focus stayed on France and Putin, something else was happening underneath. No one asked whether this was appropriate. No one stopped the sequence. And that silence is part of the evidence, because when statements this extreme don't trigger immediate correction, they start to feel normal. And that normalization is exactly what sets up what came next. The escalation didn't slow down. It widened. As the questions continued, Trump shifted from trade threats to territory, Greenland. On camera, he said the United States has to have it. He said Denmark can't protect it. He dismissed centuries of sovereignty with a single line, saying a boat went there 500 years ago and therefore the claim didn't count. Then he added flatly that it was very important and that he would be talking about it with various people. This is where the story crosses a line that doesn't usually get crossed out loud. Threatening tariffs is one thing. Talking about taking land from a NATO-linked country is something else entirely. And notice how casually it was framed. No mention of international law, no mention of consent, just necessity. We have to have it. Then came the contradiction. In the same stretch of remarks, Trump claimed he had done more for NATO than anybody else, even saying the alliance might not exist without him. At the same time, he was describing actions that would directly undermine NATO unity: pressure on France, dismissal of Denmark, public threats against European leaders. These two ideas can't coexist, and yet they were delivered back to back without pause. This kind of contradiction isn't new historically. Leaders have often justified aggressive moves by claiming they are strengthening the very systems they are destabilizing. What's different here is the openness. This wasn't leaked. It wasn't discovered later. It was stated plainly with cameras on, as if this level of escalation were normal, and that's the shift. When language like this becomes routine, the boundary between rhetoric and action starts to blur. What used to sound unthinkable begins to sound negotiable. And once that happens, the next statement stops sounding shocking and starts sounding preparatory. The next pivot revealed what this was really about: recognition, validation, and resentment. When the conversation turned to Norway, Trump zeroed in on the Nobel Peace Prize. He dismissed the idea that the Nobel Committee operates independently and said, if anybody thinks that Norway doesn't control the Nobel Prize, they're just kidding. Then he added, I don't care what Norway says. The tone mattered as much as the claim. This wasn't policy frustration. This was grievance. Moments later, he contradicted himself again. He said he didn't care about the Nobel Peace Prize, then immediately cited a letter from a very fine woman who believed he deserved it. He credited that praise as meaningful, even though he insisted the award itself didn't matter. The words moved in opposite directions, but the through line was consistent. Perceived slights, remembered personally, answered publicly. Here's the detail that permanently changes how this should be read. He tied those grievances to sweeping claims of global impact. On camera, he said he had saved tens of millions of lives. He said he had stopped 8 wars, possibly 9. He referenced India and Pakistan, long-running conflicts, nuclear powers. These weren't minor boasts. They were assertions of unilateral world-shaping power, delivered without evidence or explanation. Notice what didn't happen. No one asked how, no one pressed for details, no timeline, no verification. The claims just hung there unchallenged, layered on top of threats, territorial claims, and alliance pressure. This is where the contradiction becomes dangerous. On one hand, personal grievance, on the other, global consequence. When those two things merge in a single decision maker, the margin for error collapses. And as that margin shrinks, the pace accelerates. At this point, the night stopped being about one topic and started stacking crises on top of each other. First, the economy. Trump was asked about the first year of his second term, and he answered without hesitation. Amazing, he said. He claimed inflation was over, prices were coming down, and the economy had never been better. He described the country as the hottest anywhere in the world. Those were his words, concrete, absolute, no qualifiers. Then came Davos. When asked what message he would deliver to world leaders in Switzerland, he didn't mention coordination, stability, or shared risk. He said the message was simple, how well the United States is doing. He repeated it. We were a dead country, he said, and now we have the hottest country in the world. He pointed to 401ks, to stock markets, to records. Now watch how fast this stacks. On the same night, in the same stretch of remarks, he claimed global peacekeeping victories, threatened allies with tariffs, talked about taking Greenland, dismissed the independence of the Nobel Committee, and declared the domestic economy a historic success. Each claim reinforced the others. If everything is working, then anything is justified. If dissent exists, it must be irrational. And here's the pressure point. These claims weren't framed as debate. They were framed as settled reality. There was no acknowledgement of trade-offs, costs, or risks. Just momentum, just acceleration. What happens when this speed meets resistance? At a certain point, this stops being about speeches and starts landing in real lives. Because when leaders talk about tariffs, territory, and war as leverage, the people who absorb the shock are never the ones at the microphone. A 200% tariff on French wine doesn't stay in Paris. It shows up in prices, in supply chains, in retaliation. It hits restaurants, importers, workers, and that's before any country responds in kind. When alliances strain, markets don't wait for clarity, they react first. Then there's Greenland. While commentators floated numbers $100,000, even $500,000 per resident, the people who actually live there weren't asking for buyouts. They were asking to be left alone, to live in peace, to not become a bargaining chip in someone else's power play. That contrast matters because it shows how detached these conversations are from the people being discussed. And then there's the part that doesn't show up on stock charts. When Trump talked about no longer feeling obligated to think purely of peace, a senator who served in uniform said what usually gets ignored. When leaders don't think about peace first, it's not their families who pay the price. It's young men from Ohio, from New Mexico, from Arizona, his words. Ordinary people sent to fight wars they didn't choose. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because for a lot of people, it already does. This is the human cost hiding underneath the spectacle. And it leads to a deeper question about how this keeps happening at all. What allows this to keep happening isn't chaos, it's structure. The mechanism is simple, and that's what makes it unsettling. Power is being exercised through spectacle. Big statements create noise. Noise overwhelms verification. And by the time anyone sorts out what's real, the frame has already shifted. The story isn't whether a threat is lawful or realistic. The story becomes whether it's serious, whether it's negotiating, whether critics are overreacting. That dynamic creates leverage. When everything is said loudly and publicly, walking anything back looks like weakness. So escalation becomes the default. Threats replace process. Personal grievance replaces institutional restraint. And the audience, supporters, critics, media, gets pulled into reacting instead of evaluating. There's another incentive at work here. When international politics are turned into performance, attention itself becomes power. Every reaction reinforces the central figure. Allies are forced to respond. Markets watch, commentators argue, and the system rewards the person who can keep everyone else off balance. This is why the details matter more than the outrage. Inviting Putin, threatening France, claiming Greenland, dismissing Norway. Each move tests a boundary, not to see if it collapses immediately, but to see how much resistance appears. And when resistance is slow, fragmented, or cautious, the next move gets easier. This is smarter than it looks. And that's what makes the trajectory dangerous. From here, the path splits, but neither option is calm. One path is escalation by normalization. The statements keep coming. Allies issue careful responses. Markets adjust. Media debates tone instead of substance. Over time, what once sounded unthinkable becomes part of the background noise. Tariffs are floated, then walked back, then floated again. Territorial claims become negotiating positions. Alliances weaken not through collapse, but through exhaustion. And by the time a real red line is crossed, it feels almost expected. The other path is resistance, not outrage, but friction, legal limits, diplomatic pushback, economic consequences that don't stay theoretical. This is slower, messier, and less theatrical. But it introduces uncertainty into a system that's been driven by momentum. And momentum is the one thing this strategy depends on. Here's the key detail to watch. None of this requires a formal declaration. No vote, no speech to Congress. The movement happens through pressure, through repetition, through the quiet acceptance of that's just how he talks. And once that acceptance sets in, the next move doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be slightly more extreme than the last. That's why this moment matters more than it looks, because the next step isn't theoretical. It's already being shaped. And once it happens, it won't feel sudden at all. There's one insight that ties all of this together, and it's easy to miss if you focus on the chaos. This isn't about ideology. It's about ownership, ownership of outcomes, ownership of credit, ownership of power itself. Peace becomes something one person grants. Alliances become assets to manage. Conflict becomes a tool to extract loyalty or attention. When everything runs through a single ego, institutions stop being safeguards and start being obstacles. Reframe the entire night on that tarmac through that lens, and the contradictions disappear. Inviting Putin while threatening NATO allies isn't confusion, it's consolidation. Claiming Greenland isn't policy, it's entitlement. Dismissing Norway over the Nobel Prize isn't pettiness. It's the rejection of any system that doesn't reward loyalty. And here's the loop that matters. Once power is framed this way, backing down stops being an option because compromise looks like loss. So the only direction left is forward, louder, and riskier. Not because it's strategic in the long term, but because it's necessary to maintain control in the short term. This is why moments like this don't end cleanly. They lead somewhere. And wherever that next step lands, it will be explained as inevitable, justified, even reasonable, because the groundwork has already been laid. If you want to understand where this is heading before it fully arrives, that's what this channel is for. Follow, subscribe, and stay with the analysis. The next layer is already forming.